The Jonsplus i100 Pro is a Mini ITX PC case. Just going to let that settle in for a second. Mini ITX. Comes with a huge accessory box. The accessory box contains rather less than you might expect for such a large box. It's got some gaps there because I've already installed the 4 feet. And to give you an idea about the thinking behind the i100 Pro, you can extend the feet by screwing in these 10mm or so spacers. So you can raise your case very slightly, should that take your fancy. The user guide is in this envelope, which is sealed with Velcro. I've never seen that before. And it's a multilingual guide. It has the blue shading we've seen from a few manufacturers, including the likes of Fractal and Fantex. Works very well. You get an accessory pack of screws, which has a decal on it, which breaks down what is in the pack. It's taped closed. Open it up. Compartments. All very neat and tidy, which is what you expect for an expensive product. Handful of cable ties. Interesting brackets. PCI Express riser cable. The price of this case is £157. There are 2 variants in terms of colour, silver, or you can have black, and 2 variants in terms of tempered glass. This has tempered glass on both sides. There's also a version which has ventilated aluminium panels, but the same price. So glass and glass. Let me remove the top panel. It's quite a big job. And there you can see the space for the 360mm rad, or if you prefer a 280, or of course a 140, 120 or 240. But 240 or 360 is the limit of this case. Airflow comes in from the bottom and out the top, so although there is a front and a back, in terms of airflow it's all about the bottom to the top. Before I remove the panels and do the peel, a little reminder. Be sure to subscribe, ring the bell and join us on social media, Discord, Facebook, Twitter, all that good stuff. Okay, here we go. The 2 panels at the side are retained with a couple of screws. All the fasteners on show are black. I would personally prefer it if strategic screws were a different colour. And the front panel also comes off. That's a lift and pull. These 4 grommets go into there. That is a storage bay for a full 3.5-inch hard drive. Okay, the peel. There one. There must be. Oh, it really is that heavily tinted. There's no film on the inside, but there is a sticker on the outside under the film. Oh, why do people do that? Really heavily tinted. And here we have the interior of this, don't forget, Mini ITX chassis. On the bottom, remember the intake, we have a full-length dust filter. It's secured with a screw. I'm not sure I've ever seen that on a case before, although I guess you could remove the screw once the case has arrived with you. And out it slides. With the filter out the way, you can see we've got mounts for 3 fans in the floor. Here we have the mount for the ITX motherboard, and there we have the power supply housing. Front I/O panel is on the top. We have power button, USB 3 Type A, headset jacks, and a USB-C. Quite minimalist, but it just about covers the essentials. The layout of the chassis is unusual. The ITX board goes there without any difficulty, power supply here, and then you've got a huge amount of space for your graphics card in this chamber here. This necessitates a layout with a riser cable going under this piece of metal here, So connecting the motherboard on this side to the graphics card on this side. It's logical enough, but of course it means you have a vertical motherboard, a vertical graphics card, and the airflow going past. And you can imagine that with glass here, you're relying on the airflow going up to keep the graphics card nice and cool. And that much space suggests a beefy graphics card. A point worth mentioning here is you get two expansion slots. So triple slot, 2.5 slot graphics card might be a problem depending on the exact model you're using. That's a surprising oversight actually for what is clearly a niche market. This is an enthusiast ITX chassis that caters for an enormous graphics card. The alternative is you move some hardware around inside the chassis, swap out the rear panel, and then you have the traditional conventional layout with motherboard like so, horizontal graphics card. How that's going to work in terms of airflow remains to be seen. You've got your intakes here, your graphics card is going to be just above those, and the air has to go somewhere. But you've got a lot of space, so air will presumably go around the graphics card, up and out. At the moment, I'm completely torn as to whether this vertical graphics card layout makes a lot of sense or whether the traditional horizontal graphics card is the way to go. Also, do I use an air cooler because there's plenty of space for a large air cooler? Do I go all in one in the roof, which would then suggest an air-cooled graphics card and a liquid-cooled CPU? Or do you go custom loop? For custom loop, where does the hardware go? There's a lot of space for the radiator and the fans. You've got to have a pump and reservoir somewhere. A couple of locations spring to mind, but there are obvious difficulties. Also, the power supply. This chassis will accommodate an ATX power supply, but you can also move these mounts around and put an SFX in place. And SFX takes up one heck of a sight less space than ATX. So common sense says you go SFX. I think the sensible move is to keep this dual chamber layout vertical graphics card set up in place, put in some hardware just loosely and just see how it looks. Let's start with the motherboard assembly because that's nice and straightforward. So we have a Gigabyte Z590i Aorus Ultra, and I've gone for a Core i5 11600K. Yes, I know it's a relatively tame processor, but still it's fairly juicy, and an i5 will be sufficient for this PC, I feel. SSD is a Sabrent Rocket 4.0. On with the heatsink for the SSD. And then on with the secondary cover. And in with the board assembly. 4 screws to lock it down. Access for 3 of the 4 screws, 1, 2, 3, nice and straightforward. The 4th in that corner, overshadowed by this bracket. It's the kind of detail that gets a little frustrating. You can excuse it on a really cheap case. When you're paying proper money, I'm not so sure. And that's the motherboard in place. Next up, the power supply. The first power supply I'm going to try is a Seasonic Prime Titanium 600 watt fanless. It's a regular ATX power supply, except of course fanless. Relatively speaking, small. Not tiny, certainly not huge. With my tape measure, it is 170mm in length. I'm ignoring the block connectors. Here's the thing, this chassis, according to the user manual, supports power supplies up to 150mm if you have a fan below the power supply, 175mm if you don't have a fan in that location. So this power supply would appear to be absolutely on the limit of what you can install in this case. We've got some complicated bracketry. With 3 positions depending on whether you want the power supply up, down or in the middle. The power connector is on the rear of the chassis that goes to the top of the caddy. Power supply is therefore hanging down. Cables are going to come out of here, hence the business about clearance. I'm going to pull out some of those brackets, mount the power supply, and then we'll see how it looks. I've just seen there's an SFX adapter screwed into place, so I can remove that to open up the mounts for the ATX power supply. Worth pointing out, so ATX obviously is significantly larger than SFX, and also you'd expect it to be cheaper as a general form factor than SFX. You also get more options for connections. So this power supply will support dual graphics cards, obviously relevant in this case. It also supports two EPS connectors. A typical SFX power supply will have support for one EPS connectors. If you have a particularly high-end ITX board with two EPS connectors, you'll need to consider that when you're choosing your power supply. I've got the power supply mounted in the middle position, but it's not an equally spaced middle. So there's the screw mounting this bracket. That is the lower position. That is the upper position, i.e. really high, giving you maximum space below, which would have been convenient because it would have given me more room for cables. I think that could work. But if the power supply is all the way up, it doesn't look like there's any space at the top of the case for the cooling system. Also worth mentioning, I have not installed this bracket on the bottom to support the power supply. It's hanging off two screws here, two screws on this side. So there's that to consider. That's a lot of space taken up with the power supply. Clearly the graphics side of things is available for business. As to the cooling system, we'll leave that for the second. Next up, I think, is to remove this power supply, put an SFX there to see how that looks, and then we'll tackle graphics and cooling. Seems to me this SFX Corsair SF600 is more appropriate to the Jonsplus than even the smallest ATX power supply. I've now got some space for my cables. What about the cooler? I've installed the PCI Express riser cable. Hadn't mentioned to this point, the motherboard is actually inverted, so the riser is at the top, goes over the top of the board. Down the other side is secured with a couple of screws, all ready for the graphics card in this enormous compartment. So back on the business side, I'm going to install this Fractal Celsius S36 Ace-Tech cooler. To do that, I need to remove this bracket and then I can lower it in place and secure it all. Fractal Celsius S36, the hoses are fouling on that metalwork there, so I'm going to have to flip it round. And we have a failure. The cooler fits in the roof of the case just. I haven't yet put that bracket on. However, I can't put the pump cold plate on the processor. The hoses won't allow it. And with the cooler reversed, which is how I first tried it, with the tank at this end, it doesn't quite fit in the case. So this particular Ace-Tech 360 ain't gonna go. Here we have an AlphaCool ST30 360mm radiator, one of their latest all copper rads. It's installed, obviously it has no fans installed, has no hoses, no unions, no nothing. It's just a plain rad. It fits in and it's tight. Let me add this bracket to the equation and screw a few things down. And with the rad secure, I can move things around a little without the risk of wrenching some threads. It is worth noting you need to leave a little bit of clearance at the end of the radiator so you can put your long screwdriver down and reach the securing screws for the graphics card. Like so. And at the other end, as you can see, it's as tight as anything. So yes, this ITX case supports a 360 radiator, but blimey, it's tight. It's the unique selling point of this case, and yet accommodates a 360 rad. I mean, what do you think? I'm becoming less impressed by that aspect of things. I think the smart move here is to grab a 280 AIO off the shelf, see how that goes in instead. Fractal Design Celsius Plus S28 Prisma, your time has come, it fits. Quick question for you. You're seeing obviously a different view of this system to me. I get to see the top and the back and the sides, you get to see the front mostly. The inverted motherboard. Do the logos being the wrong way up bother you? I'm suspecting the Kit Guru audience will not like that one little bit. So the Fractal cooler, it goes in. Space in the top. Does the business. The hoses, because we've had this before with ITX chassis, everything gets squished somewhat, and now we've got kind of surplus hoses. But if I switch the rad around, I've got problems with clearance above the power supply. In this configuration with the vertical graphics card, it strikes me things are problematic. I'm just going to show you one virtue of this chassis with my Sapphire RX 6800 XT graphics card. And there we go. It's a big graphics card. There's heaps of space. Obvious thought is with glass there, you're not going to get airflow coming through, so a ventilated side panel would make sense. You're relying on the airflow coming up and out. Also, and this is a really basic question. So here we have screwdriver going down through the clearance, through the hole, into screw at the rear. All a bit involved. Why not thumb screws? Why a screw? Why not just a thumb screw? And I can go twiddle, twiddle, twiddle. What's going on? This is slightly complicated and totally unnecessary. I've had enough of this configuration. It strikes me as peculiar and pointless. I don't like it. Bearing in mind this is the default configuration. I'm going to have the cooler out and then out with that rear panel, switch over to the conventional horizontal layout, see how that feels. Out with the motherboard tray, because that has to be flipped over 180 degrees, so 4 screws. And then the back panel, also 4 screws. So out with that back panel, and then we install the alternate rear panel. This is ventilated and there is an air filter supplied, which will clip in place. I've noted a few builds using this chassis where people have added a fan at the rear, and it looks like you could get a 120 in there just. You need to be a compact one, but I can see how that's doable, and logically that's in intake bottom, exhaust top, intake at rear, why not? And then the motherboard tray goes in, but you'll note it is now hard back against this side of the chassis. So let's just tighten those screws up to secure it. One slightly annoying point here is that these 2 screws are tiddly, and these 2 screws are used throughout the chassis. I'd much prefer it if they'd used 4 screws the same. And then these 2 standoffs for the PCI Express riser need to come out. A, they're unnecessary, and B, they'll stick into the side panel. And there we have it. Big graphics card, plenty of space. What about the CPU cooler? So we've looked at the idea of putting an all-in-one or a radiator in the roof. How about an air cooler? Yes indeed, a mighty Noctua NHD 15. And let's see what happens when we offer it up. No problem whatsoever. I can install fans in the floor of the case, I can install fans in the roof of the case. Question is, who needs an ITX chassis that supports this much air cooling? I mean, what's it about? Let us address that exact question. First step is to swap out the weedy Core i5 11600K for a mighty Core i9 11900K, then a good healthy splodge of Arctic MX5 TIM, and next we install a Barrow block, which is also a combo pump reservoir unit. The radiator is an AlphaCool 280mm unit in nickel, and we're using a pair of Noctua Chromax 140mm fans. As we've seen, the 360 is problematic, 280 goes in very easily, so that's fans, radiator, block and CPU installed. For the graphics, we have my reference RTX 3080 from Palette, and this EK Quantum Vector block, which is full nickel. a huge, hefty, great big piece of gorgeous metalwork. However, it's a horizontal installation, so it's going in like yay, which means the quantum vector backplate is going to be doing all the visual work. Thermal pads in place on the PCB of the graphics card, and now it's time to splodge on my thermal compound. I'm going to use EK Zone rather than Arctic MX5 or one of the alternates that I've got. And on with the block, lining up the screw holes as we go. Phew, that's the block secured in place. Next up we have the backplate. Once the backplate is dressed up with a whole bunch of thermal pads, we can put it in place and hope nothing drops off. Hey, voila. And then we just need a few screws. Graphics card in. To my way of thinking, this looks absolutely gorgeous. I'm going to install these three Noctua F12 Chromax fans in the floor of the case, in intake, so we're kind of looking at the wrong side of them. But like so, we've got a couple of coolant tubes to rig up, fill the loop, and we'll see how the Jonsplus behaves when we get serious. Is nice. And there we have the loop. Obviously, as a loop, it's really simple. It goes from the radiator into the combo pump block unit, out to graphics, and from graphics back up to the radiator. There's my EK pressure tester in operation. I'm ready to fill the loop, and I'm going to use clear coolant because this is all about black and nickel. Understatement is the order of the day. A splash of colour wouldn't make a lot of sense to me. Right, let's turn the pump down. The thing is, of course, this loop doesn't have a tube reservoir, so while the loop itself is really simple, bleeding it is slightly painful. The PC lives, so hurrah for that. I'm going to do some thermal testing, and once I've got some numbers, I'll give you my conclusions about this case and wrap up the review. Thermal testing threw up some surprises there, and the Jonsplus passed. So drawing about 600 watts at the wall socket with the 3080 under load from TimeSpy stress test, and the CPU, the Core i9 11900K under load from Cinebench R23, temperature's good. The fans were running on a normal fan profile, which meant when the system was under barely any load, they were running at 900 RPM, which is essentially silent. And then as the temperature increased somewhat, they went slightly past 1000 RPM. Temperatures were perfectly acceptable. So the CPU was 84, the GPU was 70. Remember, Core i9 11900K is a horrible processor to cool. That's just all there is to it. And also the Barrow combo pump and CPU block unit, it seems okay to me. I don't get the impression it's a brilliant piece of hardware, whereas the graphics block from EK is, without a shadow of a doubt, a hefty great big slab of very fine metalwork. Increasing the fan speed, so full speed for the fans, all 5 of them, 1500 RPM nominal, they actually went to about 1430. Temperatures dropped. CPU went down to 81, so 3 degrees. GPU went down to 64, 6 degrees. That was slightly surprising to me and very welcome. Noise levels did increase, but it wasn't anything too terrible. The fans are at 1100 RPM at the moment, so nice and quiet. And now we have the fans running at full speed, nominal 1500 RPM, actually 1450 RPM. And then I increased the pump speed. Now the pump has a maximum rating of 4800 RPM. Crank it up to full and it's just cavitating and bubbling like crazy. Sounds horrendous, and I can't believe it's actually very helpful to the cooling. I set it to the maximum level where it's not horribly noisy and I can't hear it making any unpleasant sounds, which was 3500 RPM, and essentially that sounds to my ear the same as 2200 RPM. And yet it helped temperatures significantly. So the CPU now dropped again to 78 degrees and the GPU dropped to 58 degrees. I was genuinely stunned. GPU and CPU from start to finish came down by a huge amount. And the GPU, it was notable the differential in GPU temperatures and CPU temperatures. The GPU just dropped and dropped. I'm putting that down to the quality of the EK block over the quality of the Barrow hardware. But the Jonsplus, it worked. I was very pleased the thermal testing went so well and delivered such conclusive results. And the reason is, as you've doubtless detected during this review, my feelings have been something like a roller coaster. I started quite optimistically with this case. It looked good after all. It's got an interesting list of features. It's an ITX that's quite large, admittedly, and then I found one or two things that started to... and then I got into building in it, and that's when the frustration set in to a certain extent, and then I got the PC built, and I think it looks okay, and I did the testing, and my feelings have gone up again, so this is good. So here we go. The pros. Quality hardware, good component fit, easily supports a 280mm radiator. Yes, I know it's meant to support a 360, but the 280 goes in with no trouble whatsoever. You can install a huge air cooler. You saw a Noctua NHD15 installed. That's just a monster air cooler. The idea that air cooler can go in an ITX chassis is, well, wow. And then you've got support for multiple storage drives. Now you could argue having storage at the front, including a 3.5-inch drive bay, is silly. After all, that could be used for cable management or for cooling system, but that's the way they've gone. So if you want to put storage in this chassis, it can take it. On the downside, the cons: cable management requires work. It's just tricky, and not only is it tricky to keep it looking halfway tidy, in addition you've got to keep the cables out of the fans. This is an ITX chassis and it's 26 litres. That's very large for an ITX. It is essentially an NR200 with another chunk on the front when all said and done, because of this 360mm support. The NR200 is a decent size. This is big. When you're running in vertical graphics card mode, i.e. the default, you can only put a dual slot graphics card in there. Putting a triple slot up against the glass would probably be a bad idea. It seems wrong. You'd think a case this large, clearly aimed at enthusiasts, would support triple slot, and it doesn't. I haven't emphasized this point, but the relatively high price for this case does not include fans. You get no fans, and if you're adding on 5 Noctuas, for example, that's clearly going to eat into the cost you've got to tie up in your build. On the other hand, if you use an all-in-one cooler on your CPU, which is entirely reasonable on an air-cooled graphics card, potentially you're not buying any separate fans. So it's not entirely unreasonable of Jonsplus, but the price does not include any fans. And finally, the inherent thing with ITX, it's expensive. An ITX motherboard is typically quite expensive. SFX power supplies, it costs you more. And that's all there is to it. Overall, I'm happier with the Jonsplus i100 Pro than I expected to be. And I've ended up giving it a worth buying. Overall, it's a good one.